Hey everybody, my name is Kent. I'm lead pastor here at Epic. Everybody here at Parkside, do me a favor, help me welcome everybody who's watching from our other locations this morning, yeah? Roxborough, Center City, Fairmount, love you guys. So glad everybody's at church today. It's going to be a great day. We're starting a brand new series I'm very excited about. But before we get into all that, I got to ask you a question. How many of you know what this is? Right, a hot mess. Right? Yeah. You probably do know what a hot mess is. In fact, some of you know one or some. Some of you are one, a hot mess. Yeah. Some of you are one. Some of you actually came to church with one and are sitting right beside them. And I know who you are because right now you're like being real still. And you're trying not to breathe funny because you don't want to give it away, but you're like, yeah, they're a hot mess, right? So yeah, that could be true, absolutely. Now, what's interesting is that even if you know what a hot mess is, odds are, or at least I'd be willing to bet, that you don't know where this term originally comes from. It goes way back. Check this out. All the way back to the 19th century, this was a thing. Back in the 19th century, a hot mess wasn't what we know it as today. Back then, it referred to actually the food that a soldier would get from a mess hall. And a mess hall is what the military calls their cafeteria. So a hot mess was actually the plate of food that a soldier would get from the mess hall. A hot mess. And then in the 20th century, it took on a completely different meaning altogether. It meant that it was a hot mess was a dangerous or a dangerous environment or a dangerous situation. And so people would say things like, oh man, I got myself into a hot mess, right? Anybody ever been in a hot mess before? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So 20th century, it meant a dangerous environment or a dangerous situation. And then now, in the 21st century, with the evolution of the word hot, like, OMG, he is so hot, right? It's taken on a completely different meaning altogether again. Now, a hot mess is actually defined as an attractive disaster. An attractive disaster. Like, she's a hot mess. She's an attractive disaster. He's a hot mess. He's an attractive disaster. Now, let me say it this way. This is someone who is prettier than they are smart. You know what I'm talking about? Come on, you know somebody who's prettier than they are smart. It's like, you are pretty. Dumb. You are pretty dumb. But you are pretty. You are that too. So, right, it's someone who's prettier than they are smart. This is a person where their life is disorganized and disheveled, but you wouldn't know it at first because they're somewhat functional. Like, they show up to work, they show up to school, but when they show up, there's always something going on in the background. There's always some kind of a mess, right? Something that happened. There's always a story. And truth is, honestly, they look better than they really are. They're a hot mess. Now, if we're honest, come on, this is what we do, isn't it? Right? Like, this is like standard operating procedure for most of us. We look better than we really are, right? And that's actually our goal, is to make sure that we look better than we really are. And we do this at work, right? You show up to work, get this. It doesn't matter what is going on in your life. You show up to work with a smile on your face, just like, you know what I'm saying? They're like, hey, how's it going? You're like, eh. Like, you ain't have words for it. You just smile. That's all you can do is go, That's it. But you smile because you look better than you really are. And we don't just do this at work. We do this online, right? It doesn't matter what's really happening in your life. Your Instagram has been carefully curated to give the impression that your life is nothing but roses and rainbows. You know what I'm talking about? Like, everything's perfect. This is why every single time you go to post a picture, you have to take 30 different shots so you can get just the right angle so that your face doesn't look like your face. You know what I'm talking about? Come on, I'm preaching better than you're listening right now because we just got super real, right? Because if I looked at your photos right now, I would see like 30 different shots, and you only posted one of those things because you're like, I don't like that one because my nose looks like my nose. I need to find one where my nose doesn't look like my nose. It's true. We look better than we really are. We don't just do that online. We don't just do that at work, but we also do that at church. Right? In fact, if you're someone who shows up today and maybe one of the reasons why you don't really like church is because you look around and it seems like everyone is just way happier than you are, let me assure you, let me let you in on a little secret. You are surrounded by rows and rows and rows of hot messes. We all a hot mess. Every single one of us, we're a hot mess. The only difference is sometimes us church people just clean up good, right? It's true. It's true. We're a hot mess. Now, in this series, we're going to talk about some messes. And the messes we're going to talk about, man, they could be all kinds of messes. Could be a financial mess. Could be a financial mess as a result of debt. Or maybe it's a financial mess because of something that just happened outside of your control. And looking back, you'd say, oh, now I'm in a mess. It could be a family mess, like something happened between you and your parents, or you and your kids, or you and someone else in your family, and now you would diagnose that as a mess. It could be a habit mess. Maybe for you, like there's some type of an addiction that nobody knows about. Because at one time, it was something that you just did kind of social, but now it's something that you do in secret. And it's a pill, or it's a bottle, and you're saying, hey, nobody knows it, but honestly, I'm a mess. It could be a mess in any area of your life. It could be a professional mess, an academic mess. It could be a health mess. Some of you married a mess. Come on, somebody. You know what I'm saying? You married him, and here's the thing. You were warned. Like his 3 ex-girlfriends pulled you aside and said, girl, you don't want to do this. And you were like, no, I can fix him. But what you didn't realize is that you can fix a dog, but you can't fix a man. Was that too, we're getting too, you better stop acting like, oh, no, this church. Stop, but just be honest. Right? It's true. It's true. They warned you, but you still married a mess. Some of you married into a mess, right? And like she didn't want you to meet her family, and now you know why. You're like, man, these people crazy. These are crazy people. Some of you moved in with a mess, and the place you're at now is you're trying to figure out if they're a mess because you moved in or if they've just always been one. That kind of thing, right? Some of you were parented by 2 messes. Some of you are trying to parent a mess. Don't raise your hand. Don't move. Just stay still. It's true, right? Some of you might be at the place where you're kind of in between messes. You know what I'm talking about? Like you've got some mess in the rearview mirror, but right now, how things are right now, everything's good. Like life is great. Life is good. But you've also been around long enough to know that some mess is probably coming. You just don't know when. And that's not being pessimistic, and that's not being negative about life. It's just kind of being realistic. It's like, hey, there's mess. Like we're going to go through some stuff in this life, and you don't know exactly when, but you know it's coming. You're in between messes, and you're like, it's good right now, and I'm just going to live it up while I can. Well, see, no matter who you are or where you're from, this is something that we all have in common, the mess, right? Like whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, we've all got some mess. Whether you are the religious type or not, we've all got some mess. And here's the thing about those messes. Sometimes we create those messes. Sometimes we inherit those messes. Sometimes we get dragged into those messes. Sometimes we just wake up one day and there's mess all around and we have no idea where it came from. The truth is, we've all got some mess. Now the good news is this. The good news is that no matter how big of a mess your life is, there's always someone whose life is a bigger mess than yours. Isn't that good to know? Always somebody. No, that's not the good news. Stop that. What's wrong with you? All right. Here's the good news. The good news is this. It's not just you. Like, it's not just you. It's not just your life that's a mess. It's not just your family that has some mess or your marriage or your GPA. You are not the only one that has some mess. In fact, the truth is that we've all made a mess. We all are a mess. We all have been in a mess. And we all are just one step away from becoming a mess, right? That's the thing that brings us all together. We're all a mess. I'm a mess. You're a mess. Here a mess, there a mess, everywhere a mess. And in light of that being true, in light of that fact, I think that should impact the way that we interact with each other. I think that should influence how we approach one another, right? And specifically 2 things, and this is a little bit of an aside from the message today, but just go with me because I'm the pastor and I can do this stuff. So here's what we're going to do. Just a couple things. I think that whenever we start to bump into somebody else and we realize, man, they're a mess. They are a hot mess. Or man, they're about to make a mess, right? When we acknowledge that or see that or recognize that, I think in that moment, we've got to be people that are willing to bring more compassion than we do criticism. We gotta bring more compassion than we do criticism. Listen, it was Jesus who said, before you point out the speck in someone else's eye, you better make sure you pull the plank out of your own. Right? Like before you get all high and mighty and start to judge everybody, man, you should stop. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't say something to your friend. In fact, that's the loving. If you see them about to make a mess, the loving thing to do is to say something, to care enough for them to confront. Right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't say something, but I am saying that you should say something in a loving way. And you know what I'm talking about, because you can look back at a time in your life when you were going through something messy, and instead of being loved, you just felt judged. And other people abandoned you or left you or said some hard things and didn't even care for you or walk you through or listen. Instead of feeling loved, you felt judged. And all that did was drive you further away. And I'm just saying that, man, as followers of Jesus, we should probably take a cue from him. And instead of bringing criticism, we should be people who bring compassion in those moments. So that's the first thing. Here's the second thing. I think the fact that we're all a mess, here a mess, there a mess, everywhere a mess. I think the fact that that's true, I think that should be a reminder to us that we really do need each other. Because the truth is that sometimes the messes that we make are bigger than we can get out of on our own. You ever been there? I mean, if you've ever been to the place where you dug a hole that was so deep, you looked up and thought, how am I ever going to get up out of this? But then someone came along and you were on the receiving end of someone helping you up out of that mess. You know how grateful you were for that person and how grateful you are now for that person. Listen, other people's messes are an opportunity for us to step in and lend a helping hand. Lend a helping hand. Just imagine where the church would be. Just imagine how different the reputation of Christians would be if we just would have gotten these two things right. If instead of bringing criticism, we brought compassion. And instead of walking away, we actually walked toward a mess and thought and asked the question, how can we lend a helping hand? Can you imagine how different Christians would be seen if we'd just gotten those two things right? Game changer. And this is actually part of the reason why when Jesus came to the earth, when he stepped onto the pages of history, it's part of the reason why almost no one recognized him for who he was. That he was from God, that he was part of God. Almost no one recognized that about him. And here's why. Whenever people thought of God back then, they thought of a judge. They thought of someone who would strike you with lightning if you stepped out of line. That was the idea. That was the concept of God. But when Jesus came to the earth, he introduced something completely different. Grace. Like he introduced grace into the world. Like they were all expecting Judge Judy God. Nobody was expecting Grace God to show up. But that's who showed up, Grace God. And so listen, if you've got some mess in your life, number one, you should know you are not alone. Come on, we've got some mess too. Every single one of us. And number two, you should know that through Jesus, you can find grace. And we're going to talk about that next week. That's exactly what we're talking about. And listen, that means that if you're here, in some ways, this is just kind of a setup for next week's message. So if you're here this week, that means you have to be here next week. It's like watching half a movie. You can't walk out in the middle of the movie. You got to be back and see how this sucker ends. So make sure you put it on your calendar to be here next week as we kind of wrap up this big thought that we're talking about. Now today, in the rest of our time, I want to share with you one reason why the messiness in your life is actually a good thing. And I'm not even going to make you wait for it. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now. All right, so here it is. One reason why the messiness in your life is actually a good thing. It's a good thing because recognizing your messiness is just baby steps away from acknowledging God. The messiness in your life is a good thing because recognizing your messiness is just baby steps away from acknowledging God. That in some ways, the messiness of your life can serve as a lens or a filter or a pathway for you to see through to the other side and discover the existence of God, the presence of God, to discover God. That your messiness can be a pathway to that. Now, that's a pretty heady thought, and we actually learn about this from the Apostle Paul. Let me tell you about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was this guy who went to all the best schools and graduated top of his class, like brainiac, super, super, super smart. And when he became a follower of Jesus, he spent his time traveling around the rim of the Mediterranean, starting a bunch of different churches. And then he would hear things about what was going on with these churches, and he would write them some letters, in some cases to correct some things, in some cases just to dialogue and encourage them and to challenge them. And in other cases, he was writing them to try and explain some high-level theological ideas or even some complex ideas at times. And this is one of those ideas. This is one of those high-level, complex, sometimes confusing kinds of things. And what makes it even more confusing is that Paul was so smart. You ever read something that someone really smart wrote, and you're just like, I can't even read this. It's like, that word's got too many syllables. Like, what is that? You need a dictionary to look up every other word, like to figure out what in the world they're talking about, right? Paul's that kind of smart. And when he writes this, when he says this, man, it takes a little work to kind of get through it, right? So we're gonna work through this together. So I have to confess, it's a little heady, it's a little out there, but you are not the average audience, right? You're like, no, we are. We are so average. No, we're gonna make it. We're gonna do it together. I just need you to hang in there with me. All right. So I want you to see what Paul says about this idea. Okay, it's Romans chapter 3, starting in verse number 19. Here's what Paul said. It says, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law." Now this was just a fancy way of saying that the law is for those that are under it. That the law is for those that are under it. In other words, if you are an American citizen, then you are under American law, right? If you're an American citizen, you're under American law. If you are the citizen of another country, then you're under the laws of that country. You're bound to those laws. If you make a contract with somebody and you sign a deal, then you are held to the stipulations of that contract. That's all that he's saying, is that the law is given to those that are under it. And when Paul talks about the law here, Paul's actually talking specifically about the law of God. And that's the law that's found in the Old Testament. There are like 613 different laws that Jewish people followed. And that was their law. That was the thing that they were under. But we can extrapolate this a little bit because it's a little more broad than that. It's not just the law of the law of God, because there's also the law of the New Testament, or the law of Christ. And the law of Christ is this idea that if I'm a follower of Jesus, then I'm held responsible to treat other people the way that God has treated me through Jesus. That's what I'm responsible to do, to treat other people the way that God has treated me through Jesus. But there's not just that. There's also the law that's written on our hearts, or the law of our conscience. And these are the things that is like we just kind of intuitively know, I just think that's wrong, or I think that's right, or, man, I really should do that, or I shouldn't do this. Those things that we just kind of universally know. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like, we all just kind of know that's not okay. Or man, you probably shouldn't lie. We probably should tell the truth. Or, man, it's not okay to hurt other people. It's those things that are written on our hearts or written on our conscience. It's the law of our conscience, or the law of our heart. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Regardless of where you find yourself in that spectrum, if you're Jewish, then Old Testament law, that's your deal. If you're a follower of Jesus, then New Testament, the idea of treating other people the way Jesus treated them, how Jesus treated you, treating other people that way, that's the law. If you're not like the religious type, you've at least got a law on your heart. You've at least have the law of your conscience. And here's what's interesting about that. Every single one of us have violated that law. You know what I'm saying? Like at the very least, we've all done something that we knew we shouldn't do. Like we've all messed up. And what's interesting about this idea that we've all messed up is that when we do, like when we blow it, when we violate the law of our heart, the law of our conscience, or even the law of Christ or the law of the Old Testament, when we violate those laws and someone calls us out on it, someone says, hey, like your boss calls you out and says, hey, like you're late. Like our first reaction is not to be like, yes, no, our first reaction is, I'm on time all the time. Like I was late this one time. Are you serious? And then we say something like this. We look back at our boss and we say, but nobody's what? Perfect. But nobody's perfect. Like what do you expect? Like nobody is perfect. To your boss, nobody's perfect. To your mom, nobody's perfect. To your spouse, nobody's perfect. To your friends, but nobody's perfect. What do you expect? Nobody's perfect. What's cool is that whenever you say that, when you say something like this, when you say, but nobody's perfect, you're actually saying something else that you might not recognize you're saying. And that is that there is a perfect that nobody is. When you say nobody's perfect, you're actually saying that there is a perfect that nobody is, that there is a law, that there is a morality, that there's something that's out there that you can't quite maybe put your finger on, but you kind of know it's there that you don't live up to. Like it's over you, you're under it, you kind of feel accountable to it, but you know for sure that you don't measure up to it. Like it's out there somewhere, but you can't quite, but you know that it's there. That's what he's talking about here. That when you say nobody's perfect, you're saying there is a perfect that nobody is. And then Paul jumps in and he starts to talk about why this law or this thing exists. In this verse 19, here's what he says. He says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so he's going to tell us why, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world be held accountable to God. He says, there's a law that we're all aware of in some kind of a way. We all kind of feel accountable to it, yet we know we don't measure up to it. And one of the reasons why it exists is just in case you kind of feel like you're okay because you're better than somebody else. Let me let you know you're not. Like just in case like you're in a good position because, yeah, you're not perfect, but they're really not perfect. You know what I'm saying? Like you must be in a good place because if God grades on a curve, then you'll probably be okay, but they won't. What he's saying is, no. He says, the reason why this thing exists is because I want to make it crystal clear to you that you have no room to talk. That the word says, that you'll be silenced. Just. Because you know, no. We are all in the same boat. I'm a mess too. Years ago, I was flying out of Atlanta, coming back to Philly, and this is just after 9/11, and so they were super strict about, how early you should get to the airport so you can get your bags on the plane. And so I showed up to where you let the bags go, and I'm talking to the lady, and she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, you're late." And I looked at my clock, and I was like, I'm like 20 minutes late. Now, this is back then. This is true. They said, you had to be there 2 hours early to put your bags in. 2 hours. And I was like, really? I mean, you really? Like, they just say that. It's like, okay, the speed limit is this, but they give you this. Right? So I showed up thinking, hey, all right, I'll be a little late, but I'm not going to be that late. It'll be all right? I'll be able to get my bag on the plane. She says, sorry, sir, you're late. And I was like, I'm like 20. It's basically 15 minutes late. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I'm like, you could just put my bag on there. She's like, no, sorry, sir, I can't do that. And I'm like, listen, please, if you could just, we went to different schools together growing up, and I know we go back, we got history, and I'm trying to put on the charm, but she just kind of smiled, and she's like, no, sir, you're late. And so I was sitting there, I didn't know what to do. And I'm kind of looking at her, and I'm like, all right, I know what I'll do. I'll just sit here and look sad long enough that she'll be forced to put me on that plane. And so I'm standing off to the side, just in eyesight, so she can see me, and I'm just like, right? She should have done that. She should have been like, oh. So I'm sitting there, and then sure enough, while I'm waiting, someone else comes up, and same situation. And she says, sorry, sir, sorry, ma'am, you're late. And I was sitting there watching, and I was like, oh, that's, sucks for them. And then she was like, I can't do anything. And so they're kind of standing there. They didn't know what to do either. And here's the thing. They were like 30 minutes late. But then they kind of stand over by me, and I was like, I ain't like that. I was like, hey. I mean, I didn't say anything to them, but inside I was like, you're late. Like, what are you doing over here? And then somebody else, sure enough, they were late. And like we got a little group going on, and I'm like, hey, I want them to go over there where all the real late people are, because I wasn't that late. So I stood there long enough, and guess who she let on the plane? Nobody. Because we were all late. Every single one of us were late. We had to catch another flight. Paul says, hey, you're all late. Like, you're no better than anybody else. Everybody should be silenced because every single one of you is late. You need to know that. And then he says this, verse 20. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. He basically says, listen, you'll never be so good that God says you'll be good enough to make up for the good that you weren't in your past. He says it's too late. You're already late. Like, you already missed that opportunity. You already missed that boat. You already missed that plane. Like, you're already late. You're never going to be able to be so good in the future that you make up for the not good that you were in your past. You're already late. And then he says this. He says, rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. Ooh, that word, right? Like, that comes up. And here Paul starts to hint at the second reason why this thing exists, and that is to make us aware that we are a mess. That's why it exists, to make us aware that we're all late, that we all missed it, to make us aware that there is a gap between the standard, this thing out there that's beyond us, and where we are and who we are. That there's a gap that can't be accounted for. And what does that mean, and what are the implications? The reason why this exists is to make us aware that there's a gap between us and the standard. And so for me, whenever I look at the life of Jesus, I'm reminded that I don't love people like I should. That I'm not as patient with other people as I should be. That I'm not as considerate to others as I could be. When I look at the life of Jesus, I'm reminded over and over again that I don't forgive nearly as quickly as I should. I'm still mad at the lady who didn't let me get on the plane. Right? Over and over again, as I look at the life of Jesus, I'm constantly reminded that I am not everything I ought to be to all the people around me. I'm just not. And that law or that standard that I look to, the life of Jesus, as I look to that, it doesn't and it can't make what I've done in the past any better. It just makes me painfully aware that I am a mess. Like, I knew better, but I did it anyway. I'm a mess. I knew that I should, but I chose not to. I'm a mess. I said that I'd start, but I didn't. I'm a mess. I said I'd stop, but I didn't. I'm a mess. I said I'd never do that again, but then I did. I'm a mess. Here's the good news about that. If you've ever felt that, if you've ever had a moment like that, if you've ever known that tension, then in that moment, you experienced the law for exactly the reason why God gave it. And that is to make you aware that you're a mess. Listen, there's a message found in the messiness. There's a message found in the mess. And that is that you are one. We all are. And then a few verses later, Paul kind of lands the plane and kind of gives us the bottom line. Look what he says. It's Romans 3:23. It says this, for all have sinned, and I looked up that word all, and it means all. So, for all have sinned, and it's like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean sinned? He kind of explains it. He says, all of us fall short of the glory of God. Because that's what it means to sin. It means to fall short of a certain standard. That's what that is. He says, all of us fall short of the glory of God. He says, listen, not only do you fall short of your own standards, right, but you've also fallen short of God's standard. Listen, let me put it to you like this. Kent doesn't even measure up to what Kent thinks Kent should be. Dear Lord, if there's a God, I know for sure I don't measure up to that standard. I don't even measure up to my own standards of what I think I should be. I break those things all the time. My own conscience, the law that's written on my heart. I don't even measure up to my own standard, let alone the standard of God. I fall short of that, right? And Paul says, hey, listen. God has given us the law or this standard to make us aware that we fall short of something, of someone that's outside of us. but we're under it, and it's over us, and it's greater than us, and we feel accountable to it, yet we know we fall so short of it. God gives us that so we're aware of it, and that's the reason why. If you can see your mess, then you're just baby steps away from acknowledging God, the presence of God, the existence of God. A bunch of years after Paul came another really smart guy. His name was C.S. Lewis. Maybe you've read some of his work or seen some of his stuff. But this was a guy who is another one of those really smart people. It just said stuff, and you're like, I need a dictionary and like a bunch of other books to just understand this one book. So he wrote this book called Mere Christianity. And in the very first chapter of the book, he makes this really interesting observation. He talks about how, he says, you ever notice that when people fight, when people argue, when people quarrel, right? That's the word he uses, is quarrel. He says, whenever people fight or argue, you ever notice that they both subscribe or they both appeal to the same standard? And here's what he means by that. He says, you got two people, and one person says, this isn't fair. Like, what happened? This is not fair. And the other person says, no, it is fair. Both of them are appealing to the same standard. They're all acknowledging that there is a standard of fairness. That fairness, there is a thing called fairness that exists. There is a certain standard. What they're arguing is that whatever happened did or didn't measure up to that standard, right? They're both acknowledge that there's a standard. And then he says this, he says, when two people fight, they hardly ever say, well, forget your standard. No, they both acknowledge that there is a standard. What they argue over is whether or not what happened is or isn't up to that standard. And then after this idea that he kind of says, you ever notice this? He writes these words, and I think it's so interesting. C.S. Lewis says, he says, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. It's like, there's just this thing, like I know I should, or know we ought to, and no matter how hard I try, I just can't shake it. Like I can't get away from it. I can't push, I can't just say, forget the standard. I can't just say, well, who cares about that? You know, because if I could, I'd just get rid of it and it wouldn't be a big deal. But I can't, it sticks with me. And then he says, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law, which none of us made, because if we made it, we could just get rid of it. We could just dismiss it, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. And this is exactly what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 3, that there is something outside of us, beyond us, greater than us, but is pressing in on us. Not to try and make us or challenge us to be perfect, but to make us aware that we're not. And to make us aware that there is something or possibly someone who is. See, when you can see your mess, you're just baby steps away from being able to see God. Once I acknowledge that I've made a mess in my relationships or my finances or my health or my reputation or my career, that I've made a mess of things, it's a reminder to me that there is a God who's above and beyond all the mess. That no one is perfect because there is a perfect that no one is. And our mess becomes this beautiful pathway through which, or this beautiful filter, or this beautiful lens through which we can actually see the existence or the presence of God. And it opens the door for us to move towards something that could actually do something about our mess. Right after Paul says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, the very next verse he says this. Look what he says, verse 24. He says, and all, again, I looked it up, it means everybody. And all are justified or forgiven made right in God's eyes, brought up to the standard, freely by his grace. Wait, by our ability to be good enough? No. By our church attendance? No. By who we know? No. By how much Bible we have memorized? No. Wait, by how good we are to other people? No. By his grace. We didn't deserve it. We couldn't have earned it. When we least expected it, he loved us. By his grace, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. He says, man, if you could just acknowledge your mess, then you'll be able to see through it to the presence of a God, to a creator, to one who is good and perfect. And the good news is that if you do that, when you're able to do that, you look through that lens, you won't find Judge Judy God. No, you'll find grace God. The grace God who looked down into this world and saw the mess that we were in because of sin and chose not to leave us, but chose to roll up his sleeves and do something about it. He sent Jesus to do what only Jesus could do, rescue us from the mess, right? To make a way for our sin to be forgiven and address the mess. And that specifically is what we're going to talk about next week. Don't miss the end of this movie. Next week. And so what? We always ask that question, right? We land the plane in the bottom of a message. It's like, so what? What do I do with this? I want to give you something practical that I think might be helpful for you this week, all right? Here's what I want all of us to do at all of our locations this week. As you're going through the week and you bump up against your own mess, that habit, that thing, that attitude, that messiness, that secret, as you bump up against that, I would hope that this week you would take a moment and let it remind you that there's a message in that mess. And that is that you need God. Like, you need God. You need God. Let it remind you that there's a message in that mess, that you need God. Okay? That's one thing. Second thing I want you to do is this. As you bump up against other people's mess, or other people who are a mess, or other people who are about to make a mess, right? And you know you can see it. In fact, let's say it this way. Can we pull this last thing up? Let's all say this together. I know a mess when I see one because I am one. You know why you can see a mess in everybody else's life? Because you is one. So all together, all of our locations, let's do it again. I know a mess when I see one because I am one. So this week, as you bump up against other people's messiness, in that moment, I want you to do a couple things. Number one, I want you to ask yourself, how can I bring compassion, not criticism? How can I bring compassion and not criticism? And number two, I want to ask yourself, how can I help? How can I lend a helping hand? Instead of walking away, I think we should take a page from Jesus and lean into the mess, bring compassion, and then lend a hand. Okay? All right? Yeah. Cool. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for every person here. And Lord, I pray you give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard and the courage to do it. God, we thank you that there's a message in the mess. That is that we need you. God, I pray that you would help us to never think we're better than someone else. Know that we're all in the same boat, desperately in need of you. And this week, help us to live that out by loving others, and help us to live that out by acknowledging that we need you in our life. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys.